I grew up in a small town in Texas, where the local saying was, everyone knows everyone. My father worked as a translator at the U.S. Embassy, so my childhood was full of stories about different countries and languages. When I turned 18, my family moved to England because of my father's job, and that's where I attended college. During my years at Oxford, I immersed myself in computer technology, business management, and economics. I thrived in the challenging academic environment and built lifelong friendships, particularly with my sister Patricia. After graduating, I returned to the U.S., ready to make my own mark. My name is Dan Colton, and before I get into the more difficult part of this story, I need to introduce you to my ex-wife, Emily. I keep in shape by jogging 2 laps around the park every morning when I can. I'm 5'10" and weigh 180 pounds, staying fit by swimming several miles a week and hitting an old-school gym twice a week for weightlifting and MMA training. I'm not a martial arts expert, but I can hold my own, which is why most of my weight is muscle. Despite my degrees, a master's in computer technology, a postgraduate in business management, and a bachelor's in economics from Oxford University, people often say I somewhat resemble George Clooney. Because my father worked as a translator at the U.S. Embassy, I stayed to finish my studies while he returned to the U.S. to work as a computer repair specialist after his service. Now, I manage a well-known company and oversee a new program designed for various applications, from gaming to military use. This program's ability to handle issues in real time is crucial, and it should be ready within 6 months to a year. I love my sister Patricia, or Pat as I call her, and she loves me. We're very close, sharing everything and keeping no secrets. She's 2 years younger than me and currently works as a junior partner at a reputable New York law firm. Emily, my ex-wife, keeps fit by going to the gym at least 4 times a week. She's 5'3" with a stunning figure, 34B bust, 22-inch waist, and 33-inch hips, with red hair and green eyes to match her fiery temper. Her face is angelic, and her smile can light up a room. She's a corporate attorney at XYZ, a PR and advertising firm, where she works after earning her law degree. We met at Pat's graduation. Pat, Emily's sister, and Amy were roommates and introduced us at the graduation party. Coincidentally, we lived just 3 miles apart in the mid-sized town of Freestone, Texas. We started dating 6 months later and hit it off, getting married 6 months after that. After our wedding, Emily began her career at XYZ as a junior attorney with a modest salary plus bonuses. I worked for ABC Flight Controllers, where I assembled and dissected software code for a mid-5-figure salary and bonus. The 3-bedroom house I inherited from my grandparents was in a good neighborhood. My sister received a lump sum inheritance, while Emily's sister and parents stayed in New York. My parents had retired to Florida. Twice a year, we hosted family gatherings for Thanksgiving and Christmas at various locations. Life was good. We were happy with our modest income, nice cars, and 2 vacations every year. After 2 years, Emily was promoted to junior partner, and things began to change. She started going out with her friends on Friday nights a few times a month, and worked late more often. Naturally, I became suspicious and went about my usual routines, like reading her emails, checking her underwear, and even installing a keylogger on her laptop. Although I knew I was paranoid, it didn't mean my concerns were unfounded. I even followed her one night. Nothing inappropriate happened. She didn't even dance with other men. So why did I feel something was wrong in our marriage? Emily wanted to become a senior partner before starting a family, which would take about another 5 years. She was happy with her job. Meanwhile, I felt stuck in mine, with no opportunities for advancement. Since it was a family-owned business, promotions only went to relatives, no matter how unqualified they were. I decided to start my own computer repair business, not the kind where people bring their laptops to a shop. I targeted businesses needing enhanced security systems and system upgrades. Before jumping in, I did a business analysis and expected a slow start, but within a year, I would earn more than my current job. I sat down with Emily to explain that while the initial year would be tough, we would be better off in the long run. I avoided mentioning the new software I was developing to keep things simple. She was completely against the idea, questioning why I would risk everything when we were doing well. She was thriving, and I was in a dead-end job. Emily and I had always kept our finances separate except for our joint account, which covered all the bills. We each contributed equally for monthly expenses and saved the rest. I left my job and started my new business using savings and a loan on my house. I began advertising and made phone calls from a small workshop I rented, which had an attached office. In 3 months, I was satisfied, breaking even. My work on the new software was also progressing well. Then one evening, Emily hit me with shocking news. She was 3 months pregnant with twins. Paranoia set in, and I checked the timeline of her activities. She'd been in Miami for a week on business. It struck me then. She was cheating. I immediately decided to get a DNA test. From the moment she learned of the pregnancy, she cut off all affection, at least toward me. She insisted on abstaining, fearing damage to the babies, even though both I and the doctor reassured her she was overreacting. Despite this, we did the usual things. I attended her relaxation classes, massaged her feet every night, rubbed oil on her growing belly to prevent stretch marks, and put up with her increasingly sour moods. Meanwhile, my company was growing. I hired a fresh computer technician, Greg, and appointed May as the receptionist. Emily showed no interest in my business, so I never bothered discussing it with her. The day finally arrived when she went into labor. I was with a client, discussing a server upgrade, when I got the call. The client congratulated me and sent me on my way. Emily was already at the hospital, her go-bag ready and waiting. I rushed over, grabbed her suitcase and the DNA kit, and drove her to the hospital. She was admitted to a private room in the prenatal ward. After the doctor checked her, he said it would still take some time. Despite my doubts about the twins' paternity, I was excited about the possibility of becoming a father. The doctor suggested I go home, saying it would be a while yet, and promised to call me when it was time for the delivery. I went home, ate, sat around, and eventually fell asleep. The phone rang. Emily was fully dilated, experiencing contractions every 7 minutes. The babies were almost here. It was 2:30 a.m. I grabbed a coat and rushed to the car. Why do babies always seem to arrive at odd hours? I sped to the hospital, making it just in time to watch the first baby being delivered. A few minutes later, the second followed. The nurse checked both babies, counting their fingers and toes, then washed them. While her back was turned, I swabbed each baby for the DNA test as she helped clean up my wife. Even though I already felt a connection, I needed to know for sure if they were mine. Emily looked at me with sad eyes and said she loved me as I kissed her gently. Emily was moved to the recovery unit to rest, and they advised me to go home. The next day, I called everyone to share the wonderful news. The grandparents were thrilled, eager to see their new grandchildren. Pat and Amy promised to arrange time off to visit their niece and nephew. On my way to the hospital, carrying flowers for Emily, I dropped off the DNA kit and was told the results would take about 10 days. Emily would be staying at the hospital. The doctor said she had suffered severe tears that needed time to heal. For the next 5 days, I visited her daily, but she seemed distant and quiet. When I asked the doctor about her behavior, he simply replied, "She'll get over it. It happens sometimes." He mentioned she would be discharged on Saturday afternoon. During my visit on Friday, I counted down the hours until I could bring them home. The nursery was ready for our new babies. Saturday morning, I made sure everything was set up for her return. The safety cots were securely fastened. At 1:30, I headed to the hospital to bring my family home. I walked straight to her room, but it was empty. "Where are my wife and kids?" I asked the nurse. "Another man has already taken them," she replied. "Who?" I demanded, panic rising. I tried calling Emily's cell, but there was no response. The senior nurse arrived to handle the situation, reporting it to security, who then contacted the police. When the officers arrived, a man and a woman, both detectives, were shown to the security room to review the footage from that morning. They returned to inform me, "It seems Emily left with the man willingly. We know who he is, but we can't disclose his identity." Stunned, I asked, "What am I supposed to do now?" "Go home, Mr. Colton," they advised. "We will be in touch." Sick with worry, I sat at home, anxiously waiting for news. Around 6 that evening, I noticed the same 2 detectives knocking on my door. When neither looked me in the eye, I asked, "What's going on?" The woman spoke first. "Mr. Colton, we can't tell you where your wife and children are, but they are safe." "I'm really sorry," she added softly. I stared at her, confused. "I have no idea where my family is, and Emily won't answer her phone." The male detective stepped forward. "I regret to inform you that your wife left you and took the kids. She stated that her attorney would be in contact soon." My heart sank as I listened in disbelief. "Please, don't do anything foolish," the detective warned. "I'd hate to have to take further action." They left, leaving me alone once again. My hands trembled, and I felt hollow inside, on the verge of being sick. I had hit rock bottom. I started to cry. Sunday morning, I woke up having cried myself to sleep. I showered and put on some decent clothes. I made breakfast on autopilot. After eating, feeling a bit better, I thought, Maybe Emily's parents know something. I called her dad. "Hello," he answered. "Hi, it's me," I said quickly. "Everyone left, saying they'd be visiting next weekend. I need to tell you what happened." He tried to respond, but I cut him off. "Listen, I don't want excuses. Just call Emily and get back to me." Can't believe she would act like this. By lunchtime, I went to Denny's for an unhealthy meal. A mega burger with fries, onion rings, and a beer. Feeling a bit better, I returned home and checked the answering machine. No messages. I turned on the TV, but my mind kept replaying the events of the last few days. Eventually, I gave up. It was past midnight, so I went to bed. My thoughts wouldn't quiet down, so I got up at 6 the next morning, showered, and went downstairs for breakfast. I was sitting there staring at the news on TV when the phone rang. It was Emily's attorney. "Can you meet later today?" he asked. "Yes," I replied, feeling a glimmer of hope. 2 o'clock works." He hung up. Maybe now I'll get some answers, I thought. At his office, I was shown in immediately. I expected to see just the attorney, but Jimmy Prescott, her boss, was also there, sitting on the sofa. I decided to keep silent for the moment, needing answers. This made everyone visibly uneasy. The lawyer finally spoke. "Mr. Colton, you're here to discuss the terms of your divorce from Mrs. Emily Colton. Your wife and Mr. Prescott have a brief proposal for you. She will divorce you on the grounds of irreconcilable differences. You'll keep your business, your property, your retirement, basically all of your savings. She'll do the same. However, you must also sign documents allowing Mr. Prescott to adopt your children. In return, Mr. Prescott will deposit $2 million into an account of your choosing." I jumped up so fast I almost knocked over the desk. "Absolutely not," I shouted. "My kids are not for sale at any price. You can have that strumpet for nothing. I don't want anything to do with her, so get lost." Emily stood up and spoke softly, trying to calm me down. "Dan, I know I hurt you, and I'm so sorry. I never wanted this to happen. Jimmy and I have been seeing each other for a while, and we really want to get married. He wants to adopt the kids because, sadly, he can't have any of his own." I cut her off. "Oh, so the kids would have everything, right? A big house, the best schools, the perfect life?" I sneered. "And what do I have to offer? An old rundown house and a small computer repair business?" My voice dripped with sarcasm. "Is that why you want out? Because I lack ambition, money, and can't give the kids a better future?" Her tone turned icy. "If you refuse to sign, I'll take you to the cleaners. I'll take your house, half your income, half your savings, your 401k, your business, and I'll make sure you never see your kids again. You're in a no-win situation. Our way, you at least get something." "Go to hell, Emily," I snapped. "You have no claim to the house. It's mine. Half of nothing is still nothing. I don't have savings, and you earn more than I do, so support payments will be minimal. I'll see my kids every other weekend and happily pay child support. As for my business, without me, it doesn't exist. As for your threats, see you in court." With that, I turned and stormed out, leaving 3 stunned people behind. I went straight to Denny's for dinner. After eating, I drove home to a cold, empty house. I sat with a beer, staring at the TV, furious at myself for not checking the peephole before opening the door. I woke up around 11 to a knock, still a bit groggy. As I opened the door, it was slammed inward with such force that I staggered back, but managed to stay on my feet. 3 men rushed in, trying to grab me, but I was fully awake now. I struck the first one in the throat with extended knuckles. The second guy tried to put me in a headlock and force me to the floor. While I was breaking free, the third man hit my shin with a baseball bat, and I fell. I began losing consciousness as the first man lay on the ground, choking. The other 2 kicked me, assuming they'd finish me off. They needed to leave enough evidence for the police to follow up. As I started to black out, their leader lifted me to my feet. "Now, be a good boy and sign the papers, or we'll be back," he said, his face inches from mine. I headbutted him in the nose, feeling the warm blood splatter across my face. Now I had his DNA. I quickly pulled my handkerchief from my pocket and dabbed some of his blood onto it. Screaming, he turned away, clutching his face and cursing at me. I started to black out again, only to be jolted awake when he kicked me in the ribs. I fainted, collapsing against the wall. I woke up slowly, hearing voices, but unable to recognize who they belonged to. I saw vague shapes in the room, but couldn't identify them. Then darkness took over again. The next time I woke, bright sunlight filled the room. I looked around and saw a woman seated in a chair. It took me a moment to recognize her as Cam, the wife of my MMA instructor, Nick Wright. I tried to speak, but my mouth was too dry. I croaked out a sound. Cam came over and pressed the call button. A nurse came in and checked my vitals. She smiled and asked how I was feeling. The ice chips she gave me tasted better than the finest scotch. Cam quickly dialed her phone with one hand while holding mine. "How are you feeling?" "Glad to have you back among the living, Dan. You really scared us for a while," she said. "Like I've been hit by a truck," I croaked. "A truck might have done less damage," she replied with a wry smile. At that moment, a doctor entered. "I'm so glad to see you finally awake. You've been in a coma for 3 days, but I think you're on the mend now." "Doc, could I get something to eat? I feel like I could eat a whole cow. Just pull out the horns and wipe its rear," I groaned. Everyone laughed, but when I tried to join in, the pain in my side made me nearly pass out. The doctor adjusted my pain medication and showed me how to use the button for more morphine. I drifted in and out of a morphine-induced sleep for what seemed like hours. When Nick finally arrived, I realized it had been just over an hour. He filled me in on what happened. I'd been attacked in my home, and the neighborhood watch found my front door open. They called the police and an ambulance, and the officers found Nick's number in my phone under ice, in case of emergency. Either Nick or Cam had been with me ever since. He then described my injuries. A fractured left tibia, shattered radius, 2 cracked ribs, a perforated lung, a damaged kidney, a cracked eye socket, and a broken nose. "Other than that, you're fine," he joked, making me smile. When Nick and Cam left to go home, a detective named Graham Coles entered the room. "How much of the attack do you remember?" he asked. I recounted the leader's message. When I mentioned having a DNA sample on my handkerchief, he placed it in an evidence bag, clearly pleased. I closed my eyes for a moment, and when I opened them, the room was empty, shrouded in darkness. The next day, Nick visited and offered to let me stay at his house until I could move around on my own again. I asked him to pick up my mail from my place, and he agreed. I also inquired if he knew a good divorce attorney. He nodded and promised to get back to me. After a bit more conversation, I drifted off to sleep again. When I woke up, a nurse was checking my vitals. She mentioned that everything looked good and clean, with no signs of infection. She changed my bandages shortly after they brought me some food. Eating with one arm was tricky, so she had to cut up my meal. I slept well that night and woke up feeling refreshed. The nurse gave me a bed bath, but I didn't react. I was still too sore. Later, Nick arrived with a stunning woman who he introduced as my new lawyer, Grace Miles. She confirmed that I still had visitation rights for my kids and agreed to take on my case. We reviewed the situation together before she left. Nick stayed with me while I sorted through the mail he had brought. When I opened the DNA results, I initially felt a wave of rage, but then I started to laugh. Neither of the kids was mine. Emily had been cheating on both Jimmy and me, a classic cheater. I explained the situation to Nick once I stopped laughing, and his face went pale. Having had a change of heart, I decided to discuss a settlement. I called Grace and asked her to set up a meeting with Emily, Jimmy, their attorney, and myself at the hospital. She arranged for us to meet the next day in a borrowed office. When Nick wheeled me into the room, my arm and leg in casts, tubes running into my body, Emily looked flawless. My face, like most of my body, was bruised black and blue. Emily seemed shocked at my appearance, while Jimmy just smirked. Staring at them, I began, "Well, I changed my mind after some of your friends visited, and don't bother denying it, Jimmy. The last thing your thugs said was to sign the papers. Who else would want me to sign over the kids without the $2 million incentive?" I handed over the new paperwork my lawyer had prepared. "Your original proposal made it seem like I was selling the kids, and my lawyer explained how that could open me up to human trafficking charges. Nice try, though." Their attorney eyed the document suspiciously as I continued. "My lawyer and I have drafted a new settlement. Here it is." Grace handed the paperwork to their attorney, with copies for Emily and Jimmy. "Your offer is nothing like ours. Let me break it down for you. I keep my house, everything in it, my savings, my business, both cars, and my wife's jewelry. Additionally, she deposits the $18,000 from her not-so-secret mercantile credit account into my attorney's holding account." "You prick! That's my money! You can't have it!" Emily sputtered, her face turning crimson as a vein pulsed in her neck. Jimmy looked at her in surprise. It seemed he had no idea about her secret account. Gently, he pulled her back into her seat, still smirking. I think that moment put the first nail in the coffin of their relationship. If he hadn't cared so much for the kids, he might have walked out right then. "Sit down and shut up, you cheating liar. The adults are talking," he snapped. Emily went silent, her face shifting from red to pale. As I was saying before I was rudely interrupted, I continued, since she earns significantly more than I do, she will also pay me $2,500 a month in spousal support, deposited into my attorney's account. As for the company you both work for, to compensate for destroying my marriage and for my injuries, you will pay me $10 million, net of taxes, into my attorney's account, along with covering all my medical expenses, legal fees, and aftercare costs. This must be paid by 5 p.m. this coming Friday. Jimmy started laughing uncontrollably. Are you insane? Why should we pay you everything we have? We're only here for 20%. Excuse me? I replied. Did you say 20%? Yes, 20%, he barked. I heard you, but do you know what that means? I asked calmly. Is this some number you pulled out of thin air to back up your nonsense? He challenged. No, I said. I did thorough research on your company's clients and revenue. Since your company is publicly traded, all this information is readily available online. It's completely legitimate. Now, think about how this will impact your father's congressional campaign. After all, he's running on a family values platform. Then consider your clientele. You have several high-profile entertainment and political clients. One hint of scandal, and they'll abandon you. Next, your advertising branch. You represent 2 children's clothing stores, a baby product company, and a sports goods manufacturer. Every well-known brand will drop you like a hot potato, and you'll be scapegoated at a board meeting when things hit the fan. So, you see, $10 million is actually quite reasonable. Jimmy looked unwell, no longer arrogant. My attorney will send the full amount. It should be in her account by Friday at 5 o'clock. No one had anything else to say, but I could see Jimmy still contemplating his escape. I continued, Oh, and Jimmy, if you think my disappearance will let you off the hook, I've sent the whole story to 5 out-of-state attorneys. If anything happens to me, they'll notify the media. His defeated expression told me I'd hit the mark. As we walked away, I called out, 5 p.m. Friday. Later, back in my room, Grace asked why I gave in and let Jimmy adopt my children. She glanced at the DNA test results I handed her and laughed. You clever prick. The kids aren't yours? I'm not sure yet. This shows she was cheating on both Jimmy and me. I intend to find out and make sure Jimmy knows. Dan, I'd hate to be on your bad side. You'd have made a great attorney. Thanks, but I don't have the eliminator instinct. You do, you just haven't used it. The doctor visited later, saying I could go home the next day if I had help. I stayed with Nick and Cam for a while, visiting the hospital twice a week to change my dressings and monitor my kidney's recovery. On Friday, I waited nervously for 5 p.m., but my attorney called at 3:30. The money was in the account, $10,861,312. Wow, I was rich. Grace paid her share and transferred the rest to my checking account. Life went on. After 8 weeks of care from friends, I returned home, but the house felt empty and depressing. I decided to move closer to my sister. At work, I called Greg and May into a meeting. I explained I needed a fresh start elsewhere, thanked them, and handed over ownership of the business, including all profits earned in my absence. Then, I took them out to dinner. Next, I treated Nick and Cam to dinner and gave them a check for $500,000 for taking care of me. They tried to refuse, but I insisted. It was Jimmy's employer's money, not mine. They finally accepted. Over a glass of wine, I told them I was moving to New York to be near my sister. Nick asked about my house, and I said I'd probably rent it out. He hesitated, so I urged him to speak up. He mentioned his son Eric, who had just graduated with an engineering degree, was getting married and needed a place to live. Would I rent the house to him? I agreed, telling Nick to set the rent based on what they could afford and use the money for a college fund for their baby. Cam hugged me so hard I thought she broke my ribs again. The next day, Nick cried. I called Patty to let her know I was coming to stay with her until I found a place. She was thrilled and began planning activities. 3 weeks later, I closed my front door for the last time, shed a few tears, and handed the keys to Nick. I also left Emily's car title for his son as a housewarming gift. We hugged and promised to stay in touch. After a leisurely 2-week road trip, I arrived at Patty's. She hugged me until I gasped for air. We're going out to dinner with a friend. Just wear slacks and a shirt, she said. When we got there, Emily's sister Amy was waiting. We went to a casual diner with a bar, and I realized I'd been set up. I was annoyed at first, but I couldn't stay mad at Patty for long, so I decided to go with it. Ami hugged Patty as we reached the table, then, to my surprise, hugged me too, cursing Emily and wishing she'd rot in hell. Amy worked in accounting at an advertising company nearby. The evening went well, with Amy being the first to pull me onto the dance floor. We danced 2 waltzes and a slow song, then returned to Patty, who said, "You two look like a perfect couple." Ami blushed, and I quickly headed to the restroom. The rest of the evening, I danced with both Amy and Patty, avoiding the slow songs. At the end of the night, we put Amy in a cab and called one for ourselves. Patty just laughed and went to bed when we got home, ignoring my complaints about setting me up. The next day, we went house hunting. I preferred a house over an apartment, imagining barbecues and having friends over. Despite the high prices, thanks to being near New York City, I decided to buy with cash. After weeks of searching, I found a 3-bedroom home with separate living, kitchen, and dining areas, a decent yard, and a secure community entrance guarded 24/7. Patty loved it and joked about moving in with me. I had to furnish the house, buying all the essentials like towels, pots, and pans. Luckily, it came with kitchen appliances, but I still had to stock up on food and basics. Ami and Patty were invaluable in helping me, giving the place a homey touch rather than a man cave look. I set up one area as my workspace, complete with a custom motherboard, a top-of-the-line computer, and a fire-resistant safe. Patty and Amy insisted on a housewarming party, inviting their friends since I knew no one around. The plan worked. Soon I was on multiple social media and contact lists. For the next 3 weeks, weekends were filled with parties and barbecues. I barely thought of Emily and enjoyed my new social life. Ami and I grew closer during this time, more than friends, but not quite lovers. One evening, Patty and Amy planned to go to the theater, but Patty canceled last minute, leaving just Amy and me. During the taming of the shrew, Amy reached over and grabbed my hand. This was a surprise since the most we'd done before was a cheek kiss. After the play, we took a taxi to Amy's apartment, but it left before I could head home. I cursed, realizing there wouldn't be another cab this far out of town. Laughing, Amy said, "Then you'd better stay the night." She kissed me deeply, leading me inside. As we got to her bedroom, she asked, "What does a girl have to do to get you to sleep with her?" I figured it was time I made the first move. It was the best night of my life. "Now let me return the favor," I said, to which she replied, "What did you do to me? I've never felt this way before." At 1 p.m., we woke up starving and went to a neighborhood deli for lunch. Back at Ami's place, we talked about what had happened. She confessed she had liked me since we first met and, after my split with Emily, had turned to Patty for help in getting us together. I admitted I was interested in her too, but thought it would be inappropriate to approach my ex-wife's sister. Ami said she appreciated my consideration but had run out of patience, so she and Patty planned the previous night. Then, with a laugh, she texted Patty, "Mission accomplished." Amy drove me home to change. Unlike her sister, Amy didn't pick fights over little things, which made me feel at ease. Patty noticed this and often commented on how happy she was for us. We just seemed to fit. During this time, I was working on my project, which I finally completed. The beauty of these programs and hardware was their versatility. They could be adapted for military, gaming, aviation, and automotive applications. Knowing that thorough testing by gamers would reveal any flaws, I decided to reach out to a top game developer. When I approached the gaming company, they were skeptical, believing they already had the best programmers. After some negotiation, they agreed to a 3-month trial. I provided sealed units and tamper-proof software. After the trial, they called a meeting. I brought my sister, a corporate attorney, and one of her colleagues experienced in such negotiations, knowing the patents could be sold for much more in global sales. The company offered $120 million for the patents. However, I insisted on licensing rights for 10 years instead. My goal was $50 million plus a 1% royalty on all applications using my hardware and software for the same period. After hours of negotiation, we settled on $65 million and a 5% royalty for 10 years. Contracts were signed and a handshake sealed the deal. I was suddenly very wealthy, even after taxes. Similar negotiations followed with the military's aeronautical department, a top aircraft supplier, and a major automaker. My post-tax cash assets were valued at over $250 million, with a 10-year potential worth more than $3.5 billion. Unsure of what to do with such wealth, I sought investment advice, knowing even basic interest would earn me over $12 million annually before taxes. My sister was renting her apartment, dating another attorney, and Amy and I had moved in together. Things were getting serious. A year had passed since I started my new life, and I decided it was time for some payback against those who had hurt me. I sat down with Amy and said, "I still want to get back at your sister. Are you okay with that?" She replied, "Burn the witch. I'll help if you need it." We discussed various plans, but decided to wait before taking action. Just after dinner, the phone rang. An assistant DA from Freestone, Texas, asked if I would testify in 3 weeks. They had caught the people who attacked me. I agreed, and Amy insisted on coming with me. We decided to make a quick trip, arriving a week before the trial. We flew to Texas, where Nick picked us up and dropped us off at our motel. As a thank you, we took Nick and Cam to dinner at the Regency Club. The women looked stunning in cocktail dresses, while I wore a $2,000 Italian suit, and Nick donned his best church outfit. None of us had been to this restaurant before, so it was a special night. A uniformed doorman opened the car doors, then the restaurant door. The head waiter guided us to our table as Cam and Nick admired the pianist playing soft music. We enjoyed a light appetizer of thinly sliced melon and Parma ham, followed by our choice of entrees and fruit salad, accompanied by red and dessert wines. While savoring the wine, I noticed Emily and her husband, Jimmy, seated nearby with another couple. Ami excused herself to use the powder room, with Cam following. They had to pass by Emily's table. I watched as Emily froze, covering her mouth in shock. Amy greeted her, pointed to me, and said something that made Cam laugh. Emily rushed out of the restaurant with Jimmy in tow. When Amy and Cam returned, I asked what Amy had said. Amy explained, after Cam said hi. Emily asked who I was with. I replied, I'm with another millionaire sitting over there. Thanks for divorcing him. We were meant to be together. You obviously traded down. Then I added, I don't see what you ever saw in that stuffed monkey, and walked away. We danced and laughed about Ami's encounter late into the night. The next day, while Nick and Cam worked, Amy and I played tourists, even spending a day at a weapon range where Amy proved to be a surprisingly good shot. The day before the trial, we had dinner at Nick and Cam's house. Home-cooked food tasted so much better than restaurant fare. We toasted their upcoming wedding, and Nick shared that his son was getting married in the spring. When we met with the assistant DA, he called the case a slam dunk. My providing the DNA of the trio's leader had helped identify him. He was prepared to testify against his accomplices. The trial concluded with the leader receiving a 15-year sentence in exchange for testifying. The one I struck in the throat got 2 years since he didn't actively participate in the attack, while the other received 5 years for his first offense. After Nick and Cam dropped us off at the airport, I handed Nick an envelope and told him not to open it until after we had taken off. Inside were the deeds to my old house, a wedding gift for his son. I had shown it only to his son, understanding the importance of wedding vows. After settling in at home, I called my sister, inviting her and her partner to dinner on Friday without telling Ami. When Friday arrived, I finally let Ami in on the dinner plans, and she was thrilled. That evening, we took a limo to a restaurant I had booked 3 weeks in advance. After a hearty meal, a man in a gypsy costume approached our table and played a love ballad on his violin. Then, to Amy's surprise, he got down on one knee and proposed to her. Through tears of joy and applause from the whole restaurant, she said yes. Her expression was priceless. My sister walked over, hugged Amy, and said, "Welcome to the family." We danced for the rest of the evening before the limo took us home. Our wedding was set for early spring, and invitations went out. I stayed out of the planning, leaving it to Amy and my sister. The ceremony took place at a nearby church, and I covered lodging for all out-of-town guests, reserving a full floor at the Hilton for their 3-day stay. The wedding was a grand event, and everyone had a fantastic time. Nick and Cam said they hadn't had so much fun in years. They invited us to their son's wedding, planned for 2 months later, complete with daily excursions and evening dances. Ami and I spent 2 weeks sailing the Caribbean. We needed another break after our wedding and returned completely exhausted. By then, I had a troubleshooting team in place to handle any issues with my program and hardware, allowing me to take things slow while planning my next steps for retribution. 9 months later, our son James was born, followed by his sister Sarah a year later. We moved into a larger house, but stayed within our safe community. By this point, I was quite wealthy and even became somewhat of a celebrity, frequently attending charitable events. Some society magazines began calling Ami and me the ideal couple. However, I never let go of my desire for revenge. The pain of what had been done to me lingered. Over the past 5 years, I had hired a PI to gather information on Emily, Jimmy, and everyone connected to them, including her former boss, Troy Simmons. I wanted to know if Troy was the father of Emily's twins. The PI confirmed my suspicions. The twins were Troy's. Additionally, Emily was still seeing Troy and 2 other men, while Jimmy was occupied with his father's business and a string of escorts. The first phase of my plan began with a revelation. I sent Jimmy the twins' DNA results along with Troy's, adding a note that read, "Do the math." This confirmed the twins were not his and revealed Emily's ongoing affairs. I also included evidence of her current infidelities, then stepped back to let the chaos unfold. 2 months later, Nick called to inform me that Jimmy had kicked Emily out, using their prenup to keep the kids he had adopted. She was left with nothing, and no one knew where she had gone. Ami called Emily's parents to see if they had any information, but her father replied, "Don't contact us again," and mentioned he had only wired her a couple of $1,000s. Emily was now feeling the sting of betrayal and loss. Phase 1 was complete. Her email account was still active, so I sent her the PI's report on Jimmy, including photos of him with various women. I thought, this should stir things up. A few days later, as Ami and I watched an old movie, the security gate's intercom chimed. "Miss Prescott wants to visit," I told Amy. "Shall we let her in?" Amy shrugged. "Let's hear what she has to say." I instructed the guard to let her in. A short while later, there was a knock at the door. When Amy opened it, Emily stood there looking disheveled, hair unkempt, clothes wrinkled, no makeup. Amy gestured for her to come inside, and as she walked in, I noticed she avoided making eye contact with me. Ami handed her a cup of coffee, which she accepted gratefully before sitting down. Though part of me felt pity, I also recalled the pain she had caused. "You look like a wreck. What happened to you?" I asked. Emily broke down, unable to speak for 10 minutes. Then, through tears, she explained, "He found out I was seeing Troy all along. He figured out the twins weren't his. Then, after our marriage, he discovered I was still seeing Troy. He went wild and threw me out in the clothes I was wearing. I checked into a motel. I had my laptop in my car and a couple thousand in my account. No one would speak to me after what I did to you. My family disowned me." She glanced up, eyes red and puffy. I called his father Barry, who told me he didn't need me anymore since he now had an heir to the family fortune. My dad finally agreed to talk to me, wired me a few thousand, and told me never to call again. She looked at Amy, adding, "I had nowhere else to go, so I came here hoping you might pity me." "I didn't expect any help from you." She nodded at me. "I know you wouldn't piss on me if I were on fire. I'm sorry for everything. I was cruel and selfish and deserved this, but I miss my children. I was a terrible wife, but I was a good mother." She paused, looking defeated, and stopped her rehearsed speech. While I knew she had practiced it, most of what she said was true. I felt some pity for her, but I still wanted to deal with Jimmy, though that could wait. He had caused me suffering, and his time was coming. Emily mentioned she hadn't eaten in 2 days. When Amy asked if she was hungry, Emily nodded. Amy made bacon, eggs, hash browns, and pancakes. Emily asked for more coffee, which Amy provided, and she quickly devoured the meal. Afterward, Ami showed her to the guest bedroom and left some clothes on the bed for her. While Emily showered, Amy and I discussed our next steps. "As much as I hate her, she's still my sister. We should help," Amy admitted. I agreed, partly to annoy Jimmy by showing her recovery. For now, we decided to let her stay in the guest room until we found other options. "I'll take her shopping for basics tomorrow," Amy said. Emily came back downstairs looking more rested. We told her the plan for the next few days, and she started crying again. Later, we all went to bed. The next morning, Emily prepared breakfast, coffee, and buttered toast. I joined Amy at the table. "Dan, I'm so lucky. I didn't expect this kindness," Emily said. "You took my family from me," I replied. "What you did was unforgivable, but with Amy's love, I can finally forgive you. I won't dwell on it anymore. No more apologies. This chapter ends here." I added, "You're going shopping without me today, but just to Walmart." She nodded. Later that day, I looked for housing options for Emily. Fortunately, a one-bedroom house 2 streets away was available. It was move-in ready, fully equipped, and the owner was posted overseas for 3 years. After inspecting it, I paid a year's rent and a security deposit. When the girls returned from shopping, I shared the news. Emily hugged me, thanking me through tears. Ami grinned and blew a kiss. Emily turned to me and whispered, "I don't know what I was thinking when I messed up our marriage. I should never have let you go. Ami, take good care of him. He's the best man you'll ever find." Then she hurried upstairs, hiding her emotions. Alone with Amy, I explained my plans to help Emily and take down Jimmy and his father. We loaded Amy's van and arranged for the rest to be delivered the next day. As Emily shopped for essentials, the girls found a place for everything in the new house. It was like magic, fitting it all in. We chose to support Emily financially, giving her a credit card with a $1,000 monthly limit and $10,000 for her checking account. More hugs and tears followed. That night in bed, Amy said, "I'm glad you didn't kick Emily when she was down." I replied that I hoped she learned her lesson and would treat her next partner better. The next day, we helped Emily settle into her new house, though she insisted on doing most of the work herself. She even invited us over for dinner that night. We left the kids with a sitter and headed over. Emily prepared a delicious meal: roast beef, baked potatoes, mixed veggies with garlic butter and honey, and for dessert, baked apples stuffed with raisins and topped with ice cream. We left completely full. Emily adjusted well, and in the following weeks, Amy and I agreed to help with her divorce. I arranged a meeting with an attorney. At Patty's recommendation, we met with Brian Scott. Although he didn't approve of Emily's past actions, he agreed to take on the case. Our main goal was getting her children back. Money was secondary. "I have an idea," I said during the meeting. I allowed Jimmy to adopt the kids. When Brian mentioned this would be a challenge, I asked, "What if the children aren't biologically mine?" I explained that I had received $2 million for the kids, but refused, letting Jimmy adopt them without financial gain. However, I was considering seeking $10 million for alienation of affection against Jimmy and XYZ Advertising. I had signed a non-disclosure agreement with them to keep XYZ out of the divorce proceedings. If I violated it, I'd have to repay the money. I gave Brian the DNA reports proving that Troy Simmons was the father, showing that the children weren't mine. Therefore, Jimmy had no claim and the adoption was unofficial. This meant Emily could reclaim them. I clarified, "This isn't just for Emily, it's to mess with Jimmy and his father." Brian nodded. "Leave it to me and I'll get back to you." That evening, I told Amy what I had done, and she fully supported it. We then invited Emily over. She seemed nervous at first until I explained my plan. Grateful, she threw her arms around me, then quickly pulled back, embarrassed and apologizing. "Don't worry about it," Amy and I said in unison. "Let's leave it at that." A few days later, Brian contacted us and requested a meeting with Emily and me. He would now be representing her instead of me. During the meeting, he laid out his plan. "First," he began, "we'll file a motion to annul the adoption." He paused, looking at us before continuing. "Second, I'll report to the state that Jimmy Prescott and his father, Barry, attempted to purchase children, violating the Anti-Slavery Act of 1865. He let that sink in. "Third, we'll pursue charges for this offense. They coerced Mr. Dan Colton into allowing the adoption. Since the children weren't his biologically, the adoption is void." He showed us the DNA results to prove this. Emily will demand the return of her children, currently being kept at 218. Fifth, we'll sue Mr. Troy Simmons for sexual maltreatment as he forced the then Mrs. Colton into an affair to keep her job. Sixth, we'll pursue legal action against Jimmy Prescott for coercing Emily into a relationship that destroyed her marriage. He continued. Seventh, we'll file a lawsuit against XYZ Advertising for enabling the maltreatment and promoting the affair. Both CEO Jimmy Prescott and Chairman Barry Prescott knew about the affair and supported it, causing the marriage breakdown. Eighth, we'll charge Troy Simmons with alienation of affection, contributing to the end of Emily's marriage. Ninth, we'll charge Jimmy Prescott for the same reason. 10th, we'll go after XYZ Advertising for failing to include a morality clause in staff contracts despite knowing about the affair. And lastly, 11th, we'll sue XYZ for supporting the affair between Jimmy and Mrs. Colton, which led to the marriage's dissolution. Brian then looked at me and added, "Finally, Mr. Colton acknowledges he signed an NDA for $10 million and is prepared to repay the amount if he breaks the agreement." We stood there, stunned by Brian's comprehensive plan. Emily, though shaken, seemed ready. "I'll handle the fallout," she said. "I brought this on myself." "Move now," I told Brian, "and XYZ will face a media attack targeting Troy Simmons, Jimmy Prescott, Barry Prescott, and the company." Brian nodded, saying he'd be ready in 2 weeks. I was to launch my attack a week later. Leaving Brian's office, I felt justice was within reach. Though Jimmy and Barry put up a legal fight, Brian pressed on. A week later, as planned, I sent all the gathered evidence to every media outlet. The media pounced, camping outside the courthouse and homes of those involved. As expected, XYZ's clients began threatening to cut ties. The board fired Troy Simmons without severance, and to stop the bleeding, Jimmy and Barry Prescott stepped down. XYZ also paid Emily a 7-figure settlement. With my own compensation, I would easily cover the $10 million NDA repayment. The fallout continued. Congressman Barry Prescott, known for his family values campaign, resigned, citing illness. Soon after, the FBI found financial anomalies, including payments to escorts and misuse of campaign funds. He was called before a select committee. Less than a month later, Emily regained custody of her children. Shortly after, Amy and I drove Emily and the kids to her parents' house for a reconciliation. I told her parents, "I've forgiven her. While we may not be close friends, we're at least civil. I hope you can forgive her too." Seeing their grandchildren for the first time helped smooth things over. In the aftermath, Barry Prescott was sentenced to 3 years for campaign fund misuse. Jimmy was found guilty of attempted human trafficking and embezzling company funds, receiving a 5-year sentence. His sentence was longer because he refused to reveal where some of the missing money came from, money I had set him up to take. For my final revenge, I bribed the prison allocator to place Jimmy with a particularly dangerous inmate. Meanwhile, Emily moved into a larger home, retook her bar exams, and started working at the same law firm as Patty. Though we didn't socialize much, we occasionally babysat for each other. Emily hasn't dated since. She's focused on her career and children.